So let's talk about taking philanthropy to the next level. You know, this it's obviously that, and you've probably seen people talk about 2025 and how hard this year has been more times than we'd like to count. Um, but there's been it's really not just about USAID, right? I mean, there's a huge pullback in global development funding. And it's largely been by governments. The UK government has done some similar pullback, some of the Europeans, but it's also by larger foundations. And we started talking a little bit about this yesterday, that foundations are frozen. And you see kind of on the flip side, people like Bill Gates, Mackenzie Scott, Melinda Gates, who are trying to figure out how to up their game, so to speak, and fill in some of the gap. I think all told, including USAID, we're looking at about $100 billion development funding gap, which is astronomical. I mean, it's the budget of several countries if you were to think about it. And there's no way that even the wealthiest individuals in the world could fill that gap. And so there's been this kind of uproar in philanthropy that not only do foundations need to step up, but high net worth individuals in bulk, not just Bill Gates, right, need to think about how to fill in that gap. And you started to see some of that happening when USAID collapsed. You saw emergency funds pop up. You saw people making pledges, we're going to spend down. But then you have a foundation like MacArthur that says, we're going to add 1% of spending to our endowment. They only spend 6% of their endowment. That's nothing, right? There's more that could be done. And on top of that, there's the donor advised fund craze, which, like the effective altruists and some of the founders pledge people thinking about ways to empty their donor advised funds, which is this whole kind of individual giving world that's starting to get more attention given funding gaps. But still, even with all that, we are not going to get back to where we were. So many nonprofits and social enterprises are trying to figure out what to do. Um, and because, there is this sense that nonprofits, and pardon this word, but there is a churn, right? You feel this. You're constantly thinking about raising the next tranche of funding. It's tiring. It feels never ending. And um, I think some nonprofits, because they were so dependent maybe on one donor or on donor funding that has dried up, they're really trying to think about what could be done differently to sustain themselves as an organization that doesn't require this constant pressure of fundraising through philanthropic donors where the money is dwindling. And so there is this kind of growing competition of service models. How can nonprofits shift the way they operate to take advantage of different funding? And so, what we're going to talk about today is some of that different funding and some of those funder models and who is investing in these funder models so that you as an organizational leader can think about how this might be relevant to you. And then I will tell you about a fund that I'm hoping to launch in 2026 that I think will give you a sense. And what I'm hearing from donors, by the way, I'll also share. It'll give you a sense of where kind of some of these innovative models are resonating and where there's still quite a bit of work to do. So typically, if you're thinking about different types of funding, over time, there's really been philanthropy, which is, mostly directed towards nonprofits, given the tax exemption status, or impact investing. And impact investing is a growing place for people in global development to get involved. Obviously, in years past, investing was for the purpose of making more money. But this idea of impact investing was coined in the early 2010s as a way of giving back and making more money. So there is a financial expectation from impact investing that just isn't there in philanthropy. But there is obviously a recognition that with both types of funding, there is a betterment of society, whether it's through water, health, climate, gender, any of the things you're working on. So typically, if you're a philanthropic donor, you prefer going straight into a philanthropic giving model where you get the tax deduction. And that's largely why these foundations exist. It's why high net worth individuals created DAFs. It's largely why they give away their wealth, is because there's both good that comes out of it and there's tax benefit that comes out of it. That's how they get their financial return. But investors, if you're a philanthropic investor, you're largely doing so for the purpose of the financial return because you're not getting the tax deduction. So over time, it's been kind of either or. Most organizations that are giving money to philanthropy, but also to impact investments, are not doing so together. It's separate. And that's creating reporting challenges, due diligence requirements that can be quite onerous because a philanthropic donor asks for different information than an impact investor. And those philanthropic organizations that do both create quite a bit of administrative burden. And so there's this recognition that things have to change. However, right now, philanthropists are kind of thinking about their money as insufficient to sustain the long term. If anything has taught us, it's taught donors that I've talked to about this year, it's that the way we've been funding will not continue. It cannot continue. And that, you know, a lot of the traditional ways of reporting and learning about projects and proposals, it's just not sustainable. So that's kind of where we are from philanthropy. So philanthropists are starting to think about this idea of getting involved in blended capital. Now, for a long time, governments, through DFIs, development finance institutions, and even investors use the term blended capital as part of their investments. But you're starting to see philanthropists now dabble in blended capital. So what does that mean? That means that philanthropists can use their money to invest in kind of two different things at once. So impact capital, which could be things, we're going to go through a couple examples, but could be things like low interest loans, recoverable loans, concessional loans, even equity. If you're not a social enterprise, it's a little more challenging, but we'll talk about that. With grant money, so in different types of packages, that's really what blended capital is. It's this way of using different types of funding to kind of touch on the challenges that organizations are facing from an operational and growth and de-risking perspective. And if you like Google blended capital, I mean, a million articles come up, but I think the simplest way to think about it is really just putting different types of funding together with outcomes that are both from a social and environmental perspective and a financial perspective. Okay, and we're going to talk about a couple of those. So here are some examples of what traditional impact investors have been trying in this kind of world of impact investing and blended capital. These examples that I'm going to take you through are now being considered by philanthropists. This is pretty new, okay? So you're not seeing a ton of philanthropists publicizing this, but these are all things that they're kind of dabbling in. I won't read through this because I think it's important for you to spend some time on your own, and certainly happy to answer questions later. But generally speaking, this idea of like a recoverable grant or concessional or zero interest loan means that that donors would give money and then either receive it back in some sort of format or not at all. So recoverable is almost like a zero interest loan, kind of like a grant that gets paid back. And a concessional loan means it's a grant under the format of a loan that does not get paid back. So depending on the investor or the donor, they might have an interest in providing a loan with zero interest because on their balance sheet, it shows as a debt product, but it really operates like a grant. So you might hear donors say, like, we're happy to think about concessional loans or zero interest loans instead of a grant because their tax requirements are different and they want this to be a financial product and not a tax-free product. Similarly, with a recoverable grant, they are looking for ways to provide a grant in the tax deductible kind of status, but have it be paid back almost like a loan. So it starts to kind of just look differently on the balance sheet, but it operates very similarly to a loan. Okay, I'm going to go through these, and then if you have questions, we'll get to them in the end. Um, this idea of like loan guarantees, these are pretty straightforward, but it's things like thinking through what a loan could be dependent on, having collateral or kind of a letter of credit, something that makes the loan dependent on an outcome. You also might hear of an outcome-based loan or outcome-based grant. And again, just the semantics of the grant versus the loan is really just how the donor puts that money through their either tax deferred status or their financial balance sheet. Now, for some organizations that have like a fee for service model, and if you're thinking about changing your like way of operating to have more of a service provision or selling a product or things like that, you can also negotiate this idea of like profit sharing. I've seen this done really well where a donor will give money, um, and it's kind of tied to an expectation of a product or service being developed, and then that donor gets a portion of the revenue. And so it's kind of like a partnership with a donor, and they give you almost like the seed capital. It's kind of an innovative way to think about creating something new. Um, Convertible instruments, this is pretty heavy for impact investors. I haven't seen a ton of philanthropic donors looking into this, but there are ways to kind of take debt and convert it into equity. So if you're thinking about creating kind of a social entrepreneurial model, you could take funding as a loan and convert it into equity once you're kind of at that point. And then I just mentioned this idea of like outcome payments is becoming a very popular way for donors to like think about grants differently than just an initial outlay. So let's say a donor were to give you $100,000 for an expectation of a certain programmatic outcome. Once that outcome is achieved, you might receive additional funding, or you might not have to pay a loan back or something, depending on how it's structured. So, like I said, these are just examples. Um, they are very complicated.